are down to the last of this. I'll admit that I never thought I would be here at the end telling people that the best way back to a sane country would be through the vehicle of Donald Trump. But here we are. I was as bought into the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. campaign as anyone. This essay will be number 100. Most of the previous videos and writings were in advocacy in some form for the RFK Jr. campaign. In many ways, he has become a modern-day hero to me. Nearly every time I hear him speak, I find myself in agreement. My adventures towards the 2024 version of Trump began during COVID, that terrible authoritarian awfulness that wreaked unforeseen havoc on my family. I have 4 teenage sons, one of whom has always required extra attention. He's a wonderful, bright young man, but from his birth on, his life has required interventions and activities that encouraged him to move outside of his natural proclivities towards isolation. I can't with certainty say that he was injured by the medical system. In many ways, without it, he might not be with us. He was born premature and spent a month in incubators and having surgeries to stabilize him. But he likely was not in any condition to receive the barrage of needles and medicines that we as new parents had no understanding of. So he needs our advocacy more than his other brothers. I'm exceedingly proud of who he is and what he's gravitating towards in college, a victory unto itself. He's finding his stride, but it hasn't come without some incredible trouble. COVID was especially cruel to people like my son. He was deeply invested in his robotics courses, homeschool social gatherings, youth group, and a host of other interactive elements that gave him a sense of stability and the ability to witness that his idiosyncrasies were accepted by others like him. That all changed in March of 2020 when an unelected monster who called himself a doctor decided that his pet projects and the defeat of a president were more important than the riffraff and garbage people of this amazing country. Moving everyone into isolation had a lot more consequence for those in our society, including people like my son, who are prone to depression and anger the more isolated they are. So we watched in real time as the theater class he loved and was a major part of went to the Brady Bunch Squares version of acting disguised as a Zoom call, and midway through the course, he quit. We watched as his isolation led to sadness, then depression, then thoughts of suicide, and high points of anger and rage at his brothers, his family, and friends. Every noble act the government insisted was ours to bear the burden of had a tenfold impact on my son. Yet with each passing edict from the masters of Washington, D.C., their blatant disregard for those struggles manifested as another set of long episodes of work and attempts to help. I felt everything about the response to COVID-19 was wrong. When they announced the lockdowns and told everyone not to go to work, I said this was not the way to do it. When they named some in our society essential and others not, and shut down small churches but kept the liquor stores and weed stores open, I knew something was wrong. When they passed inflationary, ruinous acts upon our phony, unbacked currency that left a trail of inflation that is nearly unimaginable, I knew then that this whole episode was going to have a terrible end. I knew it wasn't going to be just 2 weeks. I knew as I drove by the empty hospitals that all of it was about something much more nefarious and dark. I knew every time I walked into our house from my daily essential workers' work and saw my son collapsing that this was wrong. And then just as things started to lighten up, here came the grandest separator of them all, the vaccine. Suddenly, it was undeniable and encouraged that people could categorize their fellow citizens into camps of compliant and villain. I had no interest in forcing my family into another experiment. My reservations about the medical industry were high already from our experience with our son. I had also suffered years earlier myself from myocarditis, a known side effect of this Franken vaccine, so I wasn't going to take it. Predictably, I was ostracized from my work, from my social settings, and so was my family. I had real conversations about my real estate license being subjected to state suspension because of the requirement for vaccination and my refusal to take it. I ultimately even left the place I worked because I wasn't confident that whatever variant of the month club was showing up wasn't going to be the one that ended my career. It was all real, it was all painful, and it is all still far too fresh to be forgotten. And during all of that time, I had one nagging question that hung heavy in my mind. Where was Trump in all of this? And why did he allow what I thought he knew to be wrong to happen? Somewhere in that maniacal government moment that felt exhaustingly long, I was introduced to Mr. Kennedy. Probably first through my wife and her deep adventures into podcast land, and secondly through my own curiosities. I was immediately hooked. There was no one in America, or in the world for that matter, speaking out loud as well and as principled as he was. I tried to find every podcast and interview he had been on. I had no indication at the time that he was running for president. He was just a very helpful salve to my soul in a time that was incredibly painful. The more I listened, the more I trusted him. Not because he was some kind of saint or was perfect about the things he had said in the past or how he lived his life, but he was right about the moment, and it was the moment that mattered most in the modern history of our country. When he announced he was running as a Democrat for president, I didn't care about his party of choice. I had been a Republican and Libertarian my entire voting life. He had been a Democrat, and it came naturally that he was invested in that strain of the party system. It was irrelevant to me because he was right about what mattered most, and he was a staunch defender of the rules for the road, the Constitution. That mattered to me, not because that document has much hold left on an irrational society, but because he was willing to point to it as the honorable place of agreement relative to the operation of the country. I was willing to go to bat for him. If that meant switching parties, fine. If that meant defending him to the culturally accepted media sponge soakers, fine. If that meant that it might be the end of relationships, not on my accord, but on theirs, fine. I was not going to leave this country in worse shape than I had found it. I was not about to let the authoritarians win. Mr. Kennedy was my general, and I was more than happy to give him the sword and ground to stand on that he had asked for. This election suddenly meant very much to me. I also had no illusions that the party I had seen as the least honest actor of all possible political groups wouldn't do everything in their power to ruin him. So when the rules changed and the fights happened, it wasn't just politics as usual, it was something far more sinister. Mr. Kennedy was calling the forces out that use force to accomplish their goals. He was eliminated from contention not because he lost on equal footing, but because he was required to be silenced by those in power. He spoke on economics, corporate capture, and Bitcoin. He said that the poor and minority communities had been taken for granted by the Democrats. He said that speech and freedom were more important than a cushy remainder to his own life. He said all the quiet parts out loud about war, and I was completely captivated. No one that I had ever seen in politics or power had ever used their rhetoric to jeopardize their own station in life, but Mr. Kennedy was doing it. When the path to the Democratic nomination was all but destroyed by the rules that were made up by the Democratic National Committee, I went along for the independent version of the presidency that Mr. Kennedy offered. I was enthusiastic about it, even though I knew that the road was even more substantial and likely impossible. I told anyone I could that having his voice in the mix for as long as we could was going to make our country better. Which brings me to my closing argument for this campaign. When Mr. Kennedy announced that he was suspending his run and endorsing Donald Trump, I realized that what I had hoped for all along was actually happening. The country was getting what it needed: a vehicle to win in President Trump, and a voice that could keep the focus on the fixing that is necessary.
I'm 70 years old. To save one kid at birth, it would be worth dying for. And to the opportunity and the need for me to save all of these kids, I would do anything for.
What President Trump has offered to those of us in the Kennedy world is the chance to see the things accomplished that we have longed for in America. The elimination of a fascist economic system that Mussolini would marvel at is possible if Trump wins. The poisoning of our children that has neutered and made us sicker than any mad scientist could ever dream of can come to an end if Trump is elected. And above all else, no authoritarian desires to silence us, shut us out of the discourse, close our businesses and our churches, shame us into compliance, and locking us in our homes will ever happen again if Trump is elected and Mr. Kennedy is kept close. Do I think American politics needs a Kennedy-style overhaul that his independent presidency would have fixed? Absolutely. But the next best thing is seeing him involved on the level he seems to be with the Trump administration. Perhaps in the end, whatever role Mr. Kennedy plays, it will be even more significant than had he become the president. I have no illusions that President Trump or Mr. Kennedy are some kind of silver bullets that will unwind overnight 120 years of absolute abuse of the people. But I do think it's a start. I never want to watch my children or my children's children be subjected to that kind of tyranny again. I want them to have more hope in the American dream than I do. I want their money to be real money, not some kind of fuel that is better served for a furnace of frustration and futility. I want them to tell their children that their grandfather was there in the 21st century American Revolution, and that he was an advocate for the future they are living. I never want to have anyone from my family or yours be smashed into compliance so that corporations and government cronies and their buddies can get rich off the backs of the people that they suppress. I want a new America that can be filled with the promise of natural law and agreeance to the rules of the road, an equal application of the law to you and to me, and especially to those in authority. I want a media that isn't bought and paid for by the advertisers who pay their current salaries and therefore get to tell them what to write or show or parrot on the nightly news. The reality is that all of the pieces are on the board. We just have to make the move. If that America I hope for is ever to exist, it must be now. The apparatus wants us to be silent.
They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation, and that has to stop.
And they will do all they can to ensure that silence and compliance, and then enshrine it forever. We don't have the luxury of waiting for the fight to happen another time. We won't be given another moment like this without it coming through a darker method and violence. We have to see it. We have to be bigger than the personalities at play. This is our Philadelphia summer of '76. If we are ever to be free, the moment is now. The argument for this election has become rather simple. Assemble your best team to salvage what's left of a free republic. Everyone who has made a run at dismantling it has ended up on the wrong side of the courts, the press, or with attempts on their lives. There's something here that the powerful are not interested in allowing the people of this country to see. Everyone who's left standing now has a part to play in it. We can't always have the ideal in American politics, but we have an assembly of people who take the challenge seriously and want the people to regain their country. It's not perfect, but as our founders demonstrated when their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor were on the line, there are things more consequential than our ideological purity. We're down to the last of this.